Hello and welcome to Verrocchio's David Restored, an exhibit at the High Museum of Art in Atlanta. The city of Atlanta is privileged to have the rare opportunity to host a masterpiece of the Italian Renaissance that hasn't left its home in Florence in more than 60 years. This magnificent bronze sculpture of the biblical hero David was created by Italian artist Andrea del Verrocchio. Our story begins hundreds of years ago and thousands of miles away. Leading us on our journey, the curator of this very special exhibit at the High.
Buongiorno. Welcome to the National Museum of the Bargello in Florence, where for the last 2 years we've been collaborating with some wonderful Italian colleagues. My name is Gary Radke, curator of Verrocchio's David Restored. This imposing structure was built in the 13th century as the headquarters of the Podestà, who was the chief of police of the Florentine state. In 1865, it became home to the world's most important collection of Italian Renaissance sculpture. Now let's go see Renaissance Florence and learn more about Verrocchio's David, its creation and its restoration. Andiamo. During the Renaissance, Florence was renowned as a city of talented craftsmen, manufacturers, merchants, and bankers. It still is. Supple leather goods, fine jewelry, and superb textiles all speak to how Florentines have always insisted on producing and buying goods of the highest quality. Great craftsmanship led to great art and lots of discussion about it. Still a favorite Florentine pastime. People, many without formal education, constantly passed major artworks, reminding them about Florence's history, ideals, and their own civic responsibility. Art often reflected the political or moral objectives of its wealthy patrons. Verrocchio produced his David in the 1460s, at the height of the Florentine Renaissance. This period of rebirth began in the early 1300s, when European scholars began taking new interest in ancient Greek and Roman texts, which had been virtually ignored for centuries. These old manuscripts expressed a profound appreciation for human values, education, and achievement, inspiring a great era of discourse and discovery in politics, religion, science, navigation, and the arts. As if uncovering a long-lost secret, Renaissance Florentines realized that their own city, founded in ancient Roman times, perfectly illustrated classical ideals of logic and design in the rectilinear pattern of the city's streets and the round arches and columns of its architecture. Florence's unique connection to the past, its thriving economy and renowned artists and scholars made it a natural birthplace for the Italian Renaissance. Artists began moving away from stiff, symbolic representations such as we see in this mosaic. Verrocchio and his contemporaries instead studied Roman art and worked from live models, producing works of stunning and forthright realism, enhanced with idealistic touches of beauty inspired by the ancient Roman style. Verrocchio designed his David for the Medici, a wealthy and powerful family of bankers who were great patrons of the arts. Although they claimed to be allies of the common people, and in Verrocchio's time were in fact ordinary citizens, the Medici cleverly and effectively controlled the city from behind the scenes. Their palace was the most impressive private residence in the city. Only the Medici had the financial means and social standing to commission large bronze statues like David for a private space. Bronze was a very expensive and time-consuming medium to work in, and so it was used primarily for impressive public commissions, such as the doors of the city's baptistry. Verrocchio lived and worked on the opposite side of town from the Medici in a distinctly working-class neighborhood. He trained as a goldsmith, but also acquired mastery in bronze, marble, and painting. Quite a feat, even in talent-rich Florence. Artists in Verrocchio's day trained as apprentices in active workshops, learning their trades from the bottom up. Craft shops haven't changed much from Verrocchio's time. When Verrocchio set up his workshop, one of his most promising apprentices was Leonardo da Vinci, who contributed his emerging talents to some of Verrocchio's best paintings, such as this figure in the Baptism of Christ. He was also in the shop when Verrocchio produced his bronze David. The Bible says that David was a young shepherd boy who killed the giant Goliath with nothing but a slingshot and faith in God. He was a favorite figure for the people of Florence. David's underdog triumph over Goliath became symbolic of civic virtue, God's protection, and Florence's independence and strength in the face of numerous political and military threats.
We are pleased to have with us the guest curator of this exhibit, Dr. Gary Radke. I think it's fair to say that Verrocchio is a household name in Florence and in Venice, and yet in America most people haven't heard of him. Who was Andrea del Verrocchio?
Andrea del Verrocchio was the most important sculptor, the last third of the 15th century in Florence, and he had the good fortune and the bad fortune to be the teacher of Leonardo da Vinci. And because Leonardo became so famous, poor Andrea del Verrocchio has become less well known. But Andrea del Verrocchio was the master teacher, the man who taught Leonardo da Vinci, who taught Sandro Botticelli, who taught Perugino, Lorenzo di Credi, some other artists who aren't quite as well known today in America, but who diffused his style throughout Italy in the second half of the 15th century.
And yet we don't want to lose sight of the fact that he was a tremendously significant artist in his own right, as well as a teacher.
Indeed. Besides creating other artists, he created works in bronze, in marble, as in panel painting. He was the master of the Renaissance media. He was the Renaissance man who could teach these people all the different kinds of possibilities, and who was recognized early on in his career by the Medici family, who were the most powerful bankers there, as being the person they wanted to come and do some sculpture for them.
And his masterpiece is the reason that we are here, David, created in the 1460s. What excites you about this sculpture?
Everything excites me about this sculpture. What's really exciting about this sculpture is it's the first time that a sculptor, in portraying David, turns David not just into a sculpture, that is not just a figure standing there looking like, okay, I'm just going to have a label on me and be David. He's taken David and he's thought of David's story. He's telling David's story by putting the figure into motion, by putting the head of Goliath to the side, and making this tell something about where David has been and where he's going.
And this is an incredibly lifelike representation, which is very different from previous interpretations.
Well, many of the previous interpretations had begun to be more naturalistic, but either they would be nude and therefore not the real David of the Bible, or they had other purposes to be set outside. For me, this is David as both the Renaissance and the Bible would have wanted us to know him. He's the young man. He is prepubescent. He's just about to turn into a young man, and so he's unlikely as a hero, and yet you look at his arms and there are the beginnings of muscles. You can begin to see the veins. You know that he really is, has the potential to be that hero that he becomes when he cuts off the head of Goliath after having thrown that slingshot and stone at it.
The story that everybody knows.
We hope.
He is incredibly rare and valuable. I think we can probably say priceless. Why is David in the United States, here in Atlanta, Georgia, at the High Museum?
David is here because my good friend Michael Shapiro is slightly outrageous. As director of the High Museum, we were walking around the museum several years ago in the Bargello, the National Museum of Sculpture in Florence, Italy, where David is usually kept. And we were talking about possibilities for exhibitions, and Michael saw this sculpture and said, "What an image. He's such the ideal youth. He's so inspirational. Couldn't we bring him to Atlanta?" And I said, "No. There is no way this is possible. This is a work of Renaissance sculpture that is a definitive work. It's in the textbooks. It is one that if it leaves Florence, there'll be a hole there. The Florentines will be weeping because their David is gone." And Michael said, Gary, would you just ask? Would you find out, is there any remote possibility? So I went and talked to Beatrice Strozzi, the director of the Bargello, feeling a bit timid, like, you're not going to believe what I'm going to ask you. And she said, Gary, this could not have come at a better time. We have begun work on the possibility of restoring this work. We've done the scientific studies, but we need further funding and support in order to do the restoration itself. So it was the right people at the right time.
And in fact, it was a big deal for David to leave Florence, and there was kind of a big hubbub when he left, wasn't there?
Oh, indeed, indeed. The sculpture was put on display briefly so that the Florentines could appreciate him. And then we had to close the exhibition one day early so he could be packed, so he could get here, so we would have sufficient time. And there were people at the door of the Bargello wanting to see him, wanting to know where he was. They knew he was coming to the United States, but they've now decided he's going to go back on special view for an extra month when he comes home so he can compensate for that one day that they missed him.
Well, I'm glad that it all worked out and the timing was in our favor. David looks so wonderful now, but a couple of years ago he was drab, he was lackluster, he was dirty. What happened to him?
He was dirty. He looked like he had been sort of dipped in dirt and shoe polish. His surface was very, very irregular. Over time, people had put varnishes on him. They had tried to color him completely black because it became the fashion in the 18th century to have uniformly colored bronzes. And those incrustations were all of different materials. So as they wore, it made the surface very splotchy, very irregular, and that began to create problems for the sculpture itself. It began to create the problem that pollution and dirt were seeping into the work. They were getting behind certain fragile areas. So it was really necessary. It wasn't just aesthetics. There were problems, especially with some of the gold that we've since revealed. There were problems that might actually flake off from underneath this heavy varnish.
The restoration of Verrocchio's David took more than 2 years and required the very latest, up-to-the-minute laser technology. We journey back to Florence now to show you how it was done.
A good deal of David's fame is due to its superb craftsmanship, which we can newly appreciate thanks to its restoration. The restoration process began with preliminary examinations by gamma-ray photometry, allowing us to see inside the sculpture for the first time since it was created, nearly 540 years ago.
So those are the two supports that go inside the statue before he made it. So we have very irregular thickness of bronze on the outside of the figure, and that really does indicate that it was cast just very directly right from the model rather than being from some kind of very uniform mold or something.
Che tiene la mano.
Sure, so that little support right there. And
non c'è la terra
here you
dentro.
can see that it's clay, and so it's sort of gray, but the entire hand and arm are solid bronze because it must have been modeled completely solidly in wax.
Sì, sì, sì.
Scientists in Florence and Padua used microscopes and other specialized equipment to identify at least 5 different layers of finish that had been added over time. Earlier custodians of David applied varnishes and wax to protect the work and add a sense of antiquity. But over time, the patinations had built up to look like splotchy black shoe polish. To soften the buildup, conservators applied purified water and sodium bicarbonate or baking soda. They gently removed the dissolved surface accumulations with dental tools and swabs. A rich bronze patina emerged, revealing Verrocchio's finely tooled surface, the sensuality of the work, and silkiness of the flesh. The process also brought out the veins in David's arms, giving him an even greater sense of strength and power. Recovering fragile gold leafing required a much more novel technique. Microscopic analysis indicated that Verrocchio used glue to adhere the gold leaf, rather than the more durable process of fusing it onto the bronze. This meant that mechanical cleaning was out of the question. It also indicated that the work had been intended to be displayed indoors, away from harsh elements. To vaporize the dirt, wax, and varnish on top of the gold, conservators used a laser similar to those used by surgeons. They set the wavelength so as to remove organic materials on top, but to present no danger to the gold below. Water applied with a paintbrush helped reduce pressure and heat on the gilding. We uncovered generous remnants of gold in David's hair, eyes, hem and borders of his tunic, and on his boots. Verrocchio and his patrons certainly intended this to be a splendid work.
The biblical figure of David has been depicted by artists over the centuries, and a timeline is part of this exhibit. Walk us through it, starting with Donatello.
Sure. Donatello is the most important sculptor of the early part of the 15th century, and one of his earliest masterpieces is this sculpture from 1408. It is typically Florentine, that is from Florence, in that it's the youthful David. It's not King David, it's not David with his harp making the Psalms. It's the youthful David, and it was designed for a pinnacle. It was designed to be on top of one of the buttresses, one of the supports of Florence Cathedral. So that tells us that it was a public sculpture. It was an image that the Florentines thought was not only important for their religion, but also for their city in general, because the cathedral was the center of the city's self-understanding. The Medici later on, this important banking family, do something really daring. Around 1450, they commission Donatello, again, almost 40-some years later.
Much later in his career.
Much later in his career, to make a David for their courtyard in their brand new townhouse, their brand new palazzo downtown. And Donatello seems to completely rethink, decides I'm going to do something completely different than I did before. I'm going to make him continue to be youthful, but I'm going to take off his clothes, except for his hat and his boots. This is the beginning of the Renaissance, where people are beginning to say, okay, nudity is okay because it celebrates the human body. But I think it was still
shocking.
It was still very
people.
shocking to people. And he makes this bronze sculpture, and it's placed on a pedestal in the center of the courtyard in that family palace, probably commissioned by Cosimo de' Medici, who's really the major figure, who's the founder of the city's reputation and real wealth in the mid-15th century. And this sculpture is there for a while, but the curious thing is, whenever anybody makes a drawing of it, whenever anybody makes a version of it, they always put the clothes on. They cover it up, because I think the nudity really was sort of disturbing. And the figure itself as well is rather quiet and sort of introverted. It doesn't have a lot of sense of the public hero who's defeated a great enemy, that giant Goliath.
And then just a few years later, we come to Verrocchio's David, who is wearing clothes,
Yes.
and you think that that's a very deliberate decision.
Absolutely. This is probably commissioned by Piero de' Medici, who is Cosimo's son. So we have father and son commissioning bronze for their house. And Piero has different taste. He, first of all, has a taste that's a bit more lavish. He must have adored the idea when he was told that there was going to be gold on the outfit here, there was going to be gold on the hair. And I think that in many ways, Verrocchio critiques the Donatello and says, wait, he really shouldn't be quite so effeminate. Yes, he's a boy, but he should be a hero. There should be something a bit more masculine about him. He should perhaps be a little less indecent, potentially indecent, by having the clothes on him, and that perhaps he should be a bit more confident. He should show his victory, that active stance of moving on from the head of Goliath, which he's cut off, and that he's ready now to look into the future.
And at the end of the timeline, we find the most famous David in art history, Michelangelo's marble sculpture from the early 1500s, which is very different from what we've seen before.
Extraordinarily different, and not at all naturalistic in the way that Verrocchio's was. Whereas Verrocchio's was the young boy who was the unlikely hero, Michelangelo's sculpture is this 16-foot-tall giant, this huge muscular physique. He is clearly going to win the battle. He's looking out at Goliath, but he's as tall as Goliath would have been. Michelangelo's image is very interesting then, because it really becomes an ideal portrait of how the Florentines hoped the battle would have ended, that they would be the heroes. They see them as themselves as growing up and being the great hero that is Michelangelo's David. But in this figure are several things that make it clear that Michelangelo knew Verrocchio's David and was impressed by it. The open stance of the legs and the general kind of implied movement there, and the absence of a head of Goliath. It was Verrocchio who had first taken that Goliath head and put it to the side. Michelangelo imagines Goliath out beyond. He's thought through Verrocchio's example and now made him a superhero based in Verrocchio's ideas.
We've just seen the splendid, idealized version of David that Michelangelo created out of marble, and now we come back to Verrocchio and we see this series of displays that are part of the exhibit that explain how Verrocchio's David was made, and it all starts with this. It looks like a stick figure.
It's a wonderful stick figure, and in fact, any artist who was going to make a figure out of bronze had to start like this. It's not just Verrocchio, it is the way that you do it. And what we found in the restoration revealed not only what was on the surface of the work and what it looked like in terms of the finished product, we were able to look inside the figure, and inside the figure we found that there was an iron armature, and that armature went up through the figure, through one leg and through the other, and this is where the figure began.
And all built from clay
outwards. Clay and then wax that became a mold, and the mold that got rid of the wax, and then bronze that got poured into where the wax was, and then the artist was only half done. And so the sculptor would then have to take his tools and carve and finish and work on every detail. So only half the process is the casting. Another half of the process would have been the finishing.
As you observed before, Verrocchio's fame was eventually eclipsed by his pupils, Leonardo da Vinci and Botticelli. But what was it about Andrea del Verrocchio that made those talents seek him out as a teacher?
Well, I think that they didn't necessarily seek him out as a teacher, their fathers did. And their fathers wanted to make sure that they were going to be employed in a shop that had two things going for it. One, that he was working for the top clients, and so that there was going to be business. And secondly, that Verrocchio had skill. He had a kind of craftsmanship where things were well made, so that these young students would learn how to work in the marble, how to work with paints, how to draw, how to model other kinds of materials.
So it was early career planning.
You've got it.
We want to show you the process that Verrocchio would have used in creating his David. And for that, we journey back to Florence once again, where master craftsmen and artisans show us the techniques that would have been used in the 1400s.
So how did Verrocchio make his masterpiece? He would have begun working on the image of David by asking his assistants to pose for drawings, including Leonardo da Vinci, whose handsome face is believed to have been the model for David. Once he and the Medici agreed on a design, he used a technique invented in ancient times called lost wax casting. He created his sculpture in wax, surrounded it with fire-resistant clay, melted out or lost the wax, and then filled the space where the wax had been with bronze. Let's look at the process in more detail.
I'm in Florence in an art gallery where we're still making bronze sculpture much in the manner that Verrocchio did in the Renaissance. In this case, we see a clay model that has begun to be made over the iron armature that the artist would have created. He then takes the clay model and works the surface completely in wax, giving it every detail that he wants his final sculpture to have. Once he's created that work, he now has to make an elaborate series of additions to it with rods and with cups and other elements that are going to help to create channels eventually that are going to bring bronze to the figure when it's in its mold. The mold is produced by investing this figure, that is, by wrapping it, covering it with a series of fire-resistant clays, and then heating it and melting out the wax, and then pouring in bronze that will become the final sculpture.
To make small statuettes today, workers take the empty molds and position them in sand on the floor of the foundry. In Verrocchio's day, the large mold of David would have been buried in a dirt pit. Molten bronze, copper and tin melted together, is scooped out of an intensely hot cauldron, over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, and quickly poured into the molds. Because he was casting a much larger figure, Verrocchio would have opened a plug in the bottom of the furnace and let the bronze flow continuously into a single channel, into the mold of David buried in the dirt.
When the sculpture emerges, it is heavy because it is now completely bronze. All of the figure, but also all of those risers and runners, those channels, are also bronze as well. They have to be cut off, and the artist has to go through a whole elaborate process of finishing the work. He saws off the areas here. In many cases, he may even hollow it out.
In the case of the Verrocchio figure, there was no easy way to get the clay core out, so the core still remains inside the actual sculpture, making it very heavy.
And finally, he gets to the area where we recognize the sculpture, patinated with beautiful gold leaf glued onto the surface, turning it into the masterpiece he always intended it to be.
On behalf of Georgia Public Broadcasting, I'd like to thank guest curator Gary Radke and Atlanta's High Museum of Art for collaborating with us on this study of a masterpiece of the Italian Renaissance. The exhibit, Verrocchio's David Restored, will be on display here in Atlanta until February 8th, then moves on to the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. before returning home to Florence. We'd like to thank you for joining us for this rare opportunity to explore one of the great treasures of the art world. To learn more about Verrocchio's David at the High, go to www.high.org/David.